All right. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. As you know, I'm Keturah Cappadonia, Outreach Consultant at the Southern Tier Library System. And today's webinar is an introduction to sustainable thinking for public libraries. It's the first of 4 webinars STLS is hosting on sustainability in public libraries. And we are honored today to have Rebekkah Smith Aldrich, an internationally recognized leader on the topic of sustainable futures for libraries, with us to present. Rebekkah currently serves as the executive director of the Mid-Hudson Library System in New York, and she is also the co-founder and current president of the award-winning Sustainable Libraries Initiative. You can read Rebekkah's full bio on our events calendar. It's long. She's done a lot of good work, but I will keep it brief today so that we can get into the good stuff. Welcome, Rebekkah, and thank you for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Keturah. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks for folks that made time to be with us this afternoon. This is obviously one of my favorite topics to talk about, so I jumped at the chance to come visit your system. I was last at your system about 5 years ago talking about sustainability, and it was interesting to look at the slide deck from 2017 compared to what we're talking about today, and how much has happened in the past 5 years, not only in the global world, but in the world of libraries and the thinking around sustainability and climate change. So our goal here today is to give you a broad overview of the topic, really broad, and talk about some of the words that get thrown around related to these topics, and then kind of hone in on what does it look like to operationalize some of this, and what are libraries in the country doing on this topic. We've got a growing body of libraries to draw examples from, many thanks to the Sustainable Libraries Initiative, which Keturah mentioned I'm part of. So we have over 60 public libraries now working on sustainability and becoming certified in this area. So we've got lots of great things you can learn from those folks, and you'll learn even more in the remaining series. I think you've got 3 other webinars coming on this topic to learn from more practitioners doing work just like you do in your local community. So that's the plan today, and we're going to reserve some time for questions. So if you've got questions, you can pop them in the chat box, and hopefully Keturah can keep up and help me out with moderating those towards the end, if that's all right with everyone. All right. So I just wanted to start off, with a quote. It's one of the few quotes I have in my office because I think about it all the time as an executive director. And I'm sure some of you are directors on the line today too, or folks that have responsibilities at your libraries. And you make a lot of decisions, and I make a lot of decisions, I know, for my organization. And I always keep this in mind, that I have to think about the big things. So when I'm doing the small things, they all go in the right direction. And I think this goes down to like little decisions I make about policy, or the tone we take in messaging, or purchases that we make in the organization. All of them add up to tell a story about our organization. And that's really the theme of the webinar here today, is thinking about all the choices that we make, and are we deliberately doing them in a way that lives our values out loud. So that's just something to keep in mind as we move through the content here in this hour. So I mentioned we're going to start really, really broad, and you don't get much broader than planet Earth. So as we think about living on this earth and what it's like to be a local and global citizen, we all got a very hard lesson in that starting in 2020 with the pandemic. We all learned that if we didn't work together, that pandemic was just going to get worse and worse, and more folks are going to get sick, and to the point of perishing. So thinking about that acute experience of the pandemic and what it looked like to pull together as a community to not only flatten the curve at the beginning to keep people out of the hospital, but to also address a lot of the social issues that were just laid bare by the pandemic. I remember so clearly in my system, just the shocking speed at which it was revealed how many people were not secure in their food sources. We had so many people just cut off from the school lunch program, or food pantries where their donations were just drying up. And we saw literally lines of people in cars waiting for food in our communities. And we saw libraries really step in and help bridge that gap in my system. I still have libraries with refrigerators on their front porches helping distribute food in our community. So you can see just in that acute situation that was batched into 2.5 years, and for some of us it's still going on in a bigger way than others, but it was kind of a practice run in a way for this very slow moving disaster that is climate change, which we've been hearing a lot about for a very long time, but we're just starting to see in the past maybe about the same amount of time, 2-3 years, the headlines are consistently dire, and you now see the effects, not just the warnings of climate change. We've seen here just in the past year, records set and broken and set and broken. In 2021, climate scientists noted it was the absolute worst year for climate triggered disasters, and that it will just get worse over the next 30 years. Even if we did everything right when it comes to climate change, we have at least another 3 decades of dealing of the increasingly severe effects from storms we see here on the East Coast, which we all watch with trepidation as we have family members that live further south than us, record-setting heat in the Southwest, the record-setting wildfires. And we just had a wildfire here in the Catskills this year, which was pretty frightening, something we've never really seen here in the past 25 years. Middle of the country is dealing with windstorms, and again, record-setting damage and costs to the damage that's done in the communities that are hit by these different disasters. And it looks a little different depending on where you live, which has been part of the problem of building cohesion around action on some of these issues, because someone might say, well, I'm not feeling the effects of climate change. But the predictions now are that every child alive today will be affected, profoundly affected by climate change, from increased heat waves to drought, to food shortages, to civil unrest due to diminished resources that are available to folks. We can all kind of see these ripple effects that were amplified during the pandemic, which are going to just continue to grow under climate change. So the global community discussing this, where you can see some countries are more vulnerable than the United States, they're definitely feeling the effects of this sooner than us, but we're now seeing it here in the US in more impactful ways. We now have climate refugees, people moving from the south of the country further north. Here in New York, we're going to be seeing people who've been displaced by climate change moving into our region, which may or may not be a healthy thing at the outset, but it's something that we'll all have to contend with. And so as we take a look at we look at Florida or Texas and say, whew, glad we're living here in upstate New York, we are going to feel the effects of that in increasing ways in the coming decades. And so it was convenient, I think, for a long time to say that this really wasn't an upstate New York issue, but now we're really feeling it. And I think that started about 10 years ago with Superstorm Sandy in the lower part of the state, and the year before that in 2011 with Hurricane Irene, which hit in my region in the Catskills. I never expected to see the flooding that we saw in the mountainous area of my system, and it was devastating. So to imagine more of that type of weather coming, it really makes you stop and think about, how do we help our communities get ready for this? How do we prepare our libraries for this? And how do we make sure our libraries are really strong and responsive in the face of the general changing world around us, which is a perennial question for all of us who work in libraries. So globally, there's reports that come out from the United Nations on a pretty regular basis, and I'm pretty geeky about this stuff, so I read them all. But last year's report from the United Nations, and this is a group called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a group of climate scientists from around the globe that have been trying to help policymakers understand the impacts of climate change and climate adaptation in our communities. And last year, they were trying to be as serious as possible to get people to wake up, noting this is a code red for humanity. And yes, that means us here in upstate New York as well. And so when you read these reports and you understand what's happening and the multitude of ways it impacts the world around us, from rising sea levels to droughts, all these things that might seem counterintuitive, but the common thread that's running through them is climate change, and some of the choices that we make economically that drive climate change. So as we think about the enormity of this issue, the breadth of it is absolutely breathtaking. We have to understand that everyone needs to step up and think differently about the future to not only help mitigate climate change, like I said before, even if we did everything right, we still got another 30 years of this. So we got to learn how to adapt in the face of what's already here and already going on. And so this is going to require all of us to consider climate change as part of our job. So this mantra of every job is a climate job, to embrace wherever you sit personally and professionally, and think about what you can do in your own sphere of influence to make different choices, to model different choices, to help others learn more, or to themselves come together and problem solve in our communities. This will become an increasing role that we are all playing in library land, because what we're seeing, particularly, I'm so glad to be here in Southern Tier because I can just talk about public libraries for once instead of all types of libraries. But when you look at the folks coming through your door and what they're looking for, especially since the pandemic hit, you see people that are struggling struggling with some of the very basics of living in our world. And maybe you remember this chart from either the last time I visited you or going when you're in Sociology 101, if you ever took that class. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, addressing what folks need to be successful in life, right? You need basic access to food and water and sleep. And when you see what has happened recently with food sources being compromised, whether it be from supply chain issues, with the pandemic, with drought issues that cut off some agricultural opportunities, from the monopoly of how crops are grown, and farmers sometimes don't have the diversity or biodiversity of crops to diversify the nutritional access that we have to food. Like, as you start to really think about that, it's pretty scary, right? So when we think about other folks struggling to afford food, to afford housing in the different communities that we serve, you can see that it starts to really compromise the things above this. People being able to be paid a living wage, finding a place they can live that's nearby family. Again, feeling that sense of belonging in a community can be compromised if you're worried about housing and food and employment. And so when you think about libraries and the ideal work that we do, and hoping that we're at the pinnacle of this pyramid working on self-actualization, we realize there's a lot of work to be done lower down on the pyramid that's being exacerbated by the current conditions in our world. And this is, again, perhaps a slow-moving disaster, but a lot of this was brought home very acutely in the past 2.5 years. So, you can maybe live in an area where climate change is not the most popular phrase, and you don't want to, be caught out talking about it. But the truth is the effects are here, and we have to deal with them one way or the other. So I just wanted to share, I hope you recognize this young woman. Her name is Greta Thunberg. She's one of the most well-known climate activists in the world now, thanks to not only her school strike, which many dismissed at the outset, but once she got a microphone in her hand and was able to talk to some folks in power, what we heard is a very serious and articulate young woman who is really tired of talk, is really tired of people saying there's a problem and we should do something about that. And she's calling, along with many in her generation, for the adults to actually do something, to stop, saying we hope this gets better, or hopes and prayers on that situation down in wherever the latest storm hit. But she's asking you to act, because now is the time. Her phrase here, I want you to act, as if the house was on fire, because it is. It's no longer about what might happen. It's already here. It's already happening. So what do we do? How do we stand up and live up to the promise of our generation to serve the generations coming after us in a way that we can be really proud of? So I often think about that in my work as a public library system person, is what's my legacy going to be after 20 plus years here at this system? Did I leave this place better than when I got here? Am I doing things that are helpful for folks? Am I expediting things, making people's lives easier? And I'm sure Keturah thinks that way, and each person in this audience thinks that way. You go to work every day because you're here to help people. And that's getting more complicated in many ways in our world, given so many of the things that are going on. So when we start to talk about climate change and what are you going to do about this? How do we create a sustainable future? It's super overwhelming because it touches on everything. And so this is a model that I'm pretty interested in. And I wrote a chapter in a book recently about this. It's called Donut Economics, because much of the issues driving climate change and the problems we're having are actually tied to economics. And so this model was created by a British economist named Kate Raworth. You can pick up her book or check out her website. She's done such good work in this area. But she's created basically a dashboard for us to think about this holistically, that it's not just about going green or having a checklist of how to recycle and compost, but we're talking about how the whole world works, right? We're talking about the ecological ceiling, the natural resources we have to use to our best advantage, how we treat the air and the water in our world, as well as acknowledging the social needs of our communities, that there are folks that are left behind or don't have the same opportunities as everyone else, and create some inequities in our communities that need to be addressed as well. And so can we find ways to perhaps avoid the shortfall that we currently see see in our social foundation and stop the overshoot of that ecological ceiling, those natural resources we have, and get more people into the safe and just space for humanity that actually puts people at the heart of what we do in this world instead of money, which can be controversial depending on who you're talking to. But I think a lot of folks in the library world think this way already. So I think some of the language that they're giving us to talk about this in new ways is really important, because when you look at the dashboard, and she and her team of researchers have created basically using this dashboard a measurement for each country in the world. This is the United States scorecard basically on the donut. And you can see the overshoot, right? That we are overusing resources that are made available to us in the natural world. And we're falling short on a lot of the social foundation things. We're seeing a lot of money being held by a minority of people in our communities. And then a lot of folks in our community are left behind or don't have that safety net they need to have a fulfilling and thriving life. So these things all being out of whack, I don't know about you, but when I look at this, I feel a little overwhelmed, like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do about this? We can't tackle all of this at once. But that's the beautiful thing about libraries, right? You can be what your community needs you to be. And so as we learn more about the challenges in our local communities, how climate change is going to affect our local geography, what economic issues are hitting our local town, that's how we start to craft what our library is going to look like moving forward. One of the very hopeful things I read, and this is close to 8 years ago, and now it was in an older version of that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports from the United Nations. They had recommendations for how to tackle some of the biggest issues you're seeing here on this dashboard. And you might expect some very erudite scientific solutions about carbon sequestration or building seawalls around Manhattan so the seawater doesn't get into Wall Street. But what they really talked about, they said what the world needs now is focusing on local, is working together, is recognizing and valuing diversity, and helping all to be heard. And my hand shot right up because the first thing I thought about was how well positioned libraries are to do this work, because this is what we already do. We're already centered locally. We work together so well with so many partners, as well as our neighboring libraries throughout our systems. We are some of the few places that are advocating for the voices of the marginalized to be heard, either through literature on our shelves or through the programs that we build into our buildings. And helping all be heard, this is what intellectual freedom is all about, is honoring the voices of all in our community. And so when we think about these secret ingredients that climate scientists and policymakers agree we need, we see libraries perfectly positioned to be a major player in some of the very important work that has to happen in the next few years. So in my world, and some of you know me from work I do with trustees and sustainable funding, and I'm always keeping my eye on how do we help people vote yes for libraries and volunteer for libraries. It means we have to be way more strategic moving forward than we have been in the past. And when I use that word strategy, this is a definition that I like to use because I think it speaks to the point of being deliberate. That we don't just leave it to chance. We don't hope people notice we're doing a really good job on their behalf, but we are focused. We are focused on what matters. We're responsive to what people need, and we are relevant in the world today. And that does sound so simple, but we do have to be strategic about that. We have to deliberately make motions in that direction, and we have to talk about it because nobody else was going to talk about us in that way but us. So some of the new language that you get through this program, I hope, helps you talk about perhaps what you're already doing in a new way, but also think about your strategic planning in a way that really fits the needs of your community, that responds to the kind of the trends we're seeing throughout the world today. So since the last time I visited you, the American Library Association has named sustainability as a core value. Keturah has given it the raise the roof sign, me too. This is a very big deal. This is the first time something was added to the core values of our profession in decades. So the acknowledgement of the important need to focus on climate change and focus on what our communities needs is now baked in to our professional core values. And very deliberate language was used to define sustainability, because sustainability is used in a lot of different ways. And this is unchanged from the definition I gave you back in 2017 when I visited your system. But The idea of sustainability as a core value is this idea of balance, that we're not just talking about environmental sustainability, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or financial sustainability. We're looking at the nexus of those three things. Can we make better decisions that help our organizations and our communities be sustainable? And that requires the balance of these three things to keep environmental stewardship at the fore, along with social equity and economic feasibility. We've all seen beautiful green buildings, and when you see how much they cost, you're like, well, that could never happen in my community, right? Because it's too expensive. We have to find better solutions that address these three areas, but do so in a reasonable way. So when we're looking for sustainability, we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for better choices than we made yesterday. And part of the way we make better choices than we did yesterday is using this lens of what's called the triple bottom line, which is actually a business phrase, which asks us to stop just looking at the money end of business and start to consider the impact of business on the natural world and society. Now, libraries have a much easier time doing this, but we still need some guidance sometimes in making better decisions, considering all three of these things. So this is one tool, one framework we use to help think differently about the future and move more towards an ideal future that is less of the red on the donut dashboard map that we looked at before, and starts to address better decision making that's good for people, good for the planet, and good for the taxpayers and donors who help to fund our libraries. The other very key thing in sustainability is social cohesion, which may be a phrase you've heard before, maybe not, but social cohesion is the idea that more people in your community know one another, respect one another, and have empathy for one another. And that's another thing libraries are very well positioned to do. And this is extremely key as we think about resilience of our communities. We talked a lot about climate change and the effects it's having on our society and our natural world, and how we come out of that and how we help each other through that will much depend on how well we get along. And I think we can all agree, watching the news these days, we have a lot of folks that are arguing with each other and not working well together. And so focusing at the local level on just helping neighbors be neighbors and help each other out when needed is a really big effort actually towards the ideal moving forward. And libraries can definitely play a role in that. And in fact, I'm sure your library already is. If I could see you all, I'd ask you to raise your hand and tell me if you participated in the Great Give Back last month. You know, these little small projects we do that help people come together and help each other builds that muscle memory for when larger problems arise in our communities, to have us practice working together so we can help each other in those larger moments of need in our communities. So this whole strategy we've been working on for the past 8 years in the Sustainable Library Initiative is the idea that libraries are sustainability leaders, that not a lot of people in our communities are talking like this or organizing around this, but libraries are more than halfway there based on our model. Our business model already is about sharing and education and helping people come together as neighbors. We're already doing so many of the key elements of what's needed here, but we're not known for that. Right. So the idea here is that libraries start pulling in the same direction. I serve on the board of the Center for the Future of Libraries, which for many years did trend spotting for the profession. And this idea of collective impact, we all hope we're having a good impact, right? We all have very good intentions. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. But if we want to have an actual impact, it can no longer be one person like myself or Keturah doing good work. We have to find other people to do that work with. We have to agree on what that work is and pull in the same direction to have an impact. And as you look at the enormity of the problems caused by climate change, we need not just a handful of us, we need all of us to be doing this work and going in a direction that's going to make a difference to either turn climate change around, but definitely to help build the resilience of our communities in the face of not only this, but all the crazy stuff that happens in our world, right? I'm sure you all have stories about technological disruption, political disruption, economic disruption in our different communities. All of these things require people to come together and work together for a common cause. So I think regardless of the size of library, the size of community, we all have our own local that we serve, right? We all have local businesses and local artists and local food and really wonderful local people doing great work. And so each library is centering itself in local and understanding what the challenges are, what the aspirations of that community are, and crafting our services and programs that speak to that is really essential. And it's something you've probably already been doing or heard about. Maybe you did the Turning Outward program, or you've been around the block a few times and you've done several strategic planning rounds that speak to the same issue. But we do now have to throw in some climate action to that work. So when I say climate action, I'm talking about three key things. I'm talking about identifying the challenges of your geography. What are the severe weather incidents that are most likely to hit your region, and having really good plans in place for your library to recover from these things, whether it might be extended power outages from winter storms, or maybe you're in an area that does get hit by windstorms or tornadoes are a possibility, or maybe you are in an area that's vulnerable to wildfires. Understanding the threat, building disaster preparedness plans that would help you recover as an institution as quickly as possible, and to own the fact that people need your institution in the aftermath of these types of events. Are you ready? Are you ready to help your community bounce back after big events like this? That's some good thinking to be doing now before these events happen, to think about how you'll recover your facility, your technology, making sure your staff is well cared for so they can get back to work and help the community, as well as helping the community prepare for a lot of these dire things that can happen in our world. And then really thinking about climate mitigation. Can you decarbonize the library? So this means reducing the greenhouse gas emissions caused by the footprint of your library. This can be as small as winterizing your building so that you have a tight building envelope, to thinking about different sources of energy, perhaps relying less on fossil fuels and looking to use renewable energy like solar or geothermal, using electric vehicles if you have a fleet at your library for whatever reason, but really taking ownership of your own carbon footprint as an institution and deliberately making some choices that are different to reduce that. And then third is climate justice or climate adaptation. Given the vulnerabilities of your community, how are we helping more people in our community survive and thrive in the face of what's coming? And so there's four key areas that have been identified nationally. This may or may not match up with your geography, but it's just examples to get you thinking about what we mean when we talk about climate justice. Because climate justice is not the great equalizer, as has been said for many years. It actually hits people that are poor and marginalized far harder than other folks who have means and have power in our communities. So as we think about the example we used before about access to food, so food justice in our communities, transportation equity is a big issue in upstate New York, and upholding civil and human rights in emergency management. When we're doing emergency management planning in our communities, are we thinking about everyone in that community, or just folks with a car, or just folks who have enough cash to go stay in a hotel for a week? All right, so we need to think holistically about our communities and have that reality check that not everyone's life is like the person next to them. And facilitating participatory democracy, helping people be civically engaged and understand issues and voting in elections so that they're representing their needs in the community throughout the election process or issue elections that are happening, like the recent vote here in New York on climate change investments, which won handily here in New York. So these are three areas to infuse in our thinking for planning in the future. So a lot of this work is coming out of the Sustainable Libraries Initiative, which Keturah mentioned I'm part of, and I'm the co-founder of and current board president, but I work with so many wonderful people through this program. It was started by 25 library professionals, just like yourself, here in New York, and has grown to be a national program with over 70 libraries across the country, from California to Maine, participating. There's some basic resources you can access today, from this roadmap to sustainability, which is a mobile app, or you can get a print version of it if you're analog like me and you like to write down stuff, to learn some of the basics around these issues and to start your own kind of journaling for how you're going to take ownership of every job being a climate job. We have a newsletter. We have all sorts of cool little stories about how libraries are doing work in this area. And for those of you that want to go all in, we have a Sustainable Library Certification Program, which you're going to hear all about in the fourth part of the series in this lineup that Keturah put together for you. But it's all designed around the triple bottom line, that we're all trying to make better decisions as libraries, from policies to facility decisions to operational decisions, in a way that creates sustainable libraries. And when we say sustainable libraries, what we're talking about are libraries that don't just talk the talk, but walk the walk. So we're not just saying it's good for everyone to be treated equally, but we're also demonstrating that in our personnel policies. We're not just holding a program on solar or renewable energies, but we're researching researching our own opportunities for that and how we operate our libraries. So being strong and authentic on these topics and really helping people come together, that focus on social cohesion, which many of you do already through programs like knitting circles or book discussion groups. There's so many things you do as libraries already. You're doing programming all the time that brings people together, but being more deliberate about that and widening the circle of folks that find themselves reflected in your library. And then working on those other two issues, climate change mitigation, reducing those greenhouse gas emissions in your own building and helping others in your community do the same. And then active participants in climate adaptation. So whether that's connecting with your emergency management folks in the community and being part of that network, addressing some of those issues on the last slide a few slides ago that talked about, food justice, transportation justice, civic participation. These are all things that need to be prioritized in the work we do as libraries moving forward. And I'm talking nationwide. That needs to be prioritized, not just a few libraries here and there. So like I mentioned, you're going to learn way more about the Sustainable Library Certification Program through the other three components of this series, but just a real brief introduction. This is a program that helps libraries walk through about 147 action items in a methodical way. So if you're like me, was totally overwhelmed by that dashboard and like, oh my gosh, like what does that look like to tackle that as a library? What we've done is broken it into 12 categories and just walk you through it to say, okay, well, let's take a look at this policy. Let's think about how we do this training. Let's talk about how we are treating people that work for us. All of those little decisions that we make and policies that we put in play, let's use that lens of the triple bottom line to fine tune them and to make sure they're helping us live our values out loud, as well as design services and programs that really meet the needs of your local community. So in the last time that I have here with you before we get to questions, I brought some examples for you of what it's starting to look like, because we now have 13 libraries and library systems that have been certified through the program. And we have another, as I mentioned, I think it's over 60 now libraries that are going through the program. So we've got all these amazing examples, right? It's like 60 libraries times 140 actions. It means we have a lot of great examples now of how libraries are going about this work. So you can learn from those folks that have gone before you. So I just brought a handful of examples and then we can break for questions. So if you've got questions that have occurred to you, don't hesitate to put them in the chat box and we'll manage those as soon as I wrap this part up. So part of what we do is an organizational mindset shift. So we need people to think differently moving forward. And that can be from practice and modeling, but also through policy, which sometimes it feels like a very boring part of our jobs. But as you know, policy is extremely influential in our organizations. So we think about the policies that we adopt, the elements of them. Are we making strong statements at the governance level of our organizations that demonstrate we understand this is a very big issue and we need to step up on the topic, from climate pledges to sustainability policies to purchasing policies? All sorts of policies can have elements that intersect with the triple bottom line. So we're having a growing body of policy examples now through the program of how different libraries are coming at this. And there's no one right answer, right? We're just trying to do a little better than we did last year, a little better than we did last decade, and really thinking about how we get this thinking embedded into our organization. So policy is a big area that we focus on to help people think differently about the environment, about social equity, and about economic feasibility, whether that be how we plan our financial future as an institution, from reserve funds to thinking about the kind of scary stuff that happens that we have to figure out how to find money for. These are all problems that aren't going to go away if we just ignore them, right? So confronting these issues, and like I said, might not be perfect, but at least we start going in the right direction and we're confronting the reality of what's going on today. Another big example is how we're treating our staff. Are we not only meeting the legal requirements for a minimum wage, but are we paying them a living wage? So all libraries in the program commit to make sure their full-time staff, at least the full-time staff, are getting not just minimum wage, but a living wage. And if you're not familiar with that phrase, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, has done such good work on this. So that's what you see here, the description of a living wage, what that formula looks like. And we can all relate to this, right? Like, what does it actually cost to live where we live? And is that tied to the reality of what we're paying people in our public institutions? I think you'll find that libraries, I know at least in my region, we are definitely falling behind and having trouble recruiting people because we're not keeping up salary and benefit wise. So this is about the longevity of your institution, the quality of your customer service, but also treating people with dignity and making sure they're making the money they need to live a healthy life in the region of the state that you live in. So there's a calculator available on the MIT website that goes by county. In the program, we just tell you to look at the first column of the chart because it can get overwhelming as you think about, how many kids people have. But let's just try to do the basics. If you were an individual living in this region, what would the base salary need to be to actually live here? That's a reality check for a lot of people. That's very eye-opening. And then you can go further. Some of the libraries in the program go further and do salary studies and compare what they're paying versus the school or other nonprofits. But again, it's a problem that we all know exists, underpaid library workers. We've got to start somewhere and building that up to make sure our own institutions are viable here in the future. So libraries tackle all sorts of stuff in this program, from materials management of, all the stuff we bring into our organizations. How is it getting back out? Where does it go at the end of its useful life? This is an example from the Patchogue Medford Library on Suffolk County. They don't have recycling in their town. So they came up with a homegrown solution. They created their own gathering stations for recycling and separation, and they found a place they could bring recycling. And now it's part of someone's job at the library to cart this stuff to the transfer station that they were able to identify. Another library in the program just called the village and said, why don't we have carting service in the village for recycling? And they were like, I know, that's so horrible, right? Well, we'll pick it up for you. We'll transfer it for you. So Lindenhurst Library ended up solving the problem just with a phone call. So if it's something that you don't have in your region, reaching out and finding out if other people are struggling with the topic and maybe coming up with common solutions to a widespread problem is possible. This is a great example. All of the libraries in the program go through thinking about how you clean your building. And New York State is so lucky because the Office of General Services, OGS, they offer a green cleaning program where there's free training online about how we clean our buildings, what products we use, methodologies that are less toxic than some of the choices we make today. And they do procurement too. So if you're looking for the actual products that they recommend, they've already done state contracts on a lot of those products. So again, every little decision we make, right, adds up to tell the story about how we care for people, both in our buildings and people who have to manufacture these toxic chemicals as well. Partnerships is a big part of the program. This is the Saratoga Library. And I think I saw, Katori, you've got Jen Ferris coming to talk to your folks later in the series. And Jen's not only on the board and one of the co-creators of the whole program, but what a kick-ass job she did this is just one example of one of the things she did, which was Saratoga Reads. You're probably familiar with the Big Read or One Community, One Book programs. This is along those lines. When you look at the list, not only of the books they chose over the years to line up with the triple bottom line, you also see these partners that just emerged out of the woodwork who wanted to align themselves with the library and be a part of this work. From businesses to higher education to municipalities, all wanted to be a part of these larger conversations the library was the catalyst for. Now, this next one, I'm selfish here. This is a program in my own system we've been doing for the past 2 years called the Library of Local. We're partnering with a group called the Climate Partners of the Hudson Valley, who have granted us money. So this commitment to climate change and resilience actually has drawn new money into my system. And they set up these hub libraries, these Library of Local hubs. The idea being that, again, if we bring more people together to learn together, to find resources together, that we'll be better prepared to tackle some of these big issues that are coming our way. So each of these 16 libraries has a tool lending library, a seed library, and special collections of books and programs that speak to food security and climate solutions. So these libraries are really early adopters in my system of doing this work. But in the second year, we aligned the locations of these hubs with New York State climate smart communities. And you might have a climate smart community right in your own town, which is is really cool because it means a municipality has committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and having a climate action plan. And so why wouldn't the library want to be a part of that and be a partner in that work? If there's a larger goal already in place, how wonderful. And if not, maybe you could be the genesis for helping your town think differently and maybe inspiring them to join the Climate Smart Community Program through the state government, which is a very good program to help towns think differently about the future of how we use energy and other natural resources. This is just a hodgepodge of examples. I was thinking about farming at libraries. We have the Northern Onondaga Library where you can borrow a plot of land and grow your own fruits and vegetables. Their former director was on our initial co-creator group, and she acknowledged that they, in the middle of the state, live in a food desert, and it was really expensive to get fresh fruits and vegetables. And why couldn't they just grow them on library property? So half their land is for patrons to borrow and grow their own stuff, and the other half is community-supported agriculture where the yield goes to food pantries and homeless shelters. The library farm at the Northern Onondaga Public Library, if you want to learn more about that. The Go Take a Hike. These are some of our libraries here in Mid-Hudson. They lend hiking kits, tents, camping equipment, bird watching kits, helping people get outside as a family. And this is something so simple we can all do, is to help more people connect with the outdoors, to go for a walk, to learn how the natural world around us works. So maybe we'll all care for it a little more in the future. So our libraries are having a lot of fun with these. And again, it actually drew more money into our system. The Adirondack Mountain Club donated several $1,000s to help underwrite all sorts of programs, from story walks outdoors to the bird watching kits to field guides, all sorts of cool stuff that were accelerated in our system thanks to an overt commitment to this type of work. And then repair cafes, fix-it clinics. These are awesome examples that really exemplify the triple bottom line. If you're not familiar with these programs, it encourages the connection of people in your community who know how to fix things to help teach other people how to fix things. And it does several things at once. It demonstrates that reliance on our neighbors. It helps people think about repair rather than replace, which keeps stuff out of the waste stream. And it really helps people think about their right to repair things, because we all know there's objects in our lives that are designed to fail. So we'll just buy a new one when the next model comes out and spend more money on that company's product. So repair cafes, I think, are one of the perfect exemplars of the triple bottom line. Other libraries are doing great work in disaster preparedness work, from coming up with their own disaster preparedness plans. If you're not familiar with the work of the New Jersey State Library, who's done fabulous work here, there's a whole workbook for libraries to think through disaster preparedness work. I'll send that link to Katura after if you'd like it. But making sure the library is prepared, but also the community is prepared. And so this might mean, the Citizen First Responder Corps or CERT training in your communities, or partnering with first responders, making sure residents in our communities are prepared for disasters in our communities. The right-hand example from Desmond Fish is one of my favorites, because we live in an area of the state, we're much closer to New York City, perhaps in your area, but we have a lot of folks who move up from New York City and then are mingling with folks who've lived in our area for generations, and they don't always get along so great. And what we found is that the celebration of the first responder community brought everyone together to thank these folks who volunteer their time and energy and really their whole lifestyle to serving their neighbors through the first responder community, particularly the volunteer firefighters in our region of the state. This library celebrates them every year, and it brings the whole community together to say thank you, and really just it erases that divide that people think is there, and reminds us all that we really, at the heart of what we're doing in our communities, is really truly trying to care for one another at sometimes a very basic level. And so I just really celebrate this library for doing this, because I think it's really exemplifies the kind of attitude that we hope we would see in more communities moving forward. So a couple of examples of that decarbonization that I mentioned, to use less fossil fuels. You can see the very first library in the whole country, Crisney Public Library in Indiana, which is a very conservative area, the very first library in the country to be zero net energy, which means they produce all of the electricity they need to run the building on site. So you can see solar panel array there on their gazebo. And I think there's another array on the other side of the building. But now this is very, I don't want to say fashionable, but you now see it entrenched in code in California. So one of our participants in the certification program is the San Diego County Public Library. They serve over 1 million people, and they're only building net zero facilities as they build new branches. So we're now starting to see a municipal commitment to understanding the need to decarbonize and rely less on fossil fuels, which are coming from uncertain sources, right? As we watch the global news about the war in Ukraine, the fears about oil consumption in the Middle East and Russia, and where does the United States get their oil from? I think we can all respect the idea that energy independence might be a more stable future for our country. You can see electric mini bookmobile. The Suffolk Cooperative Library System just bought an electric delivery van. And of course, solar or just general electric vehicle charging stations. There's about to be a phenomenal amount of money invested at the federal and state level in electric vehicle charging station infrastructure. And libraries are a perfect spot to be building that out. We just did it here at Mid-Hudson. I was able to get over 75% of my project funded through our utility company, who was leveraging state money on this topic to our advantage. So between that funding source and the state aid for library construction grants, the EV charging stations we installed cost us nothing out of pocket except for our project management costs. And we're not the only ones thinking like this. And this is a little story I want to tell you just to wrap things up here, but when we started the Sustainable Libraries Initiative over 8 years ago, one of our board members asked, how do we know if we're successful? And one of the things we said was, well, if other people recognize libraries as sustainability leaders, we'll be going in the right direction. And this year on Earth Day, we saw that happen. We saw the executive of Suffolk County here in New York have a press conference at the Lindenhurst Library, who's a member of our program, announcing a massive investment, millions of dollars in electric vehicle charging station infrastructure that will be located in libraries throughout that county. The county is transitioning their entire fleet of vehicles to electric vehicles. They need some place to charge them. And so they're going to do a distributed charging infrastructure using libraries. So library patrons can use the infrastructure during the day, and the county vehicles are charging overnight at their library. So again, this idea of embracing these opportunities, it can draw not only money, but attention and really powerful partners in our communities on these topics. So I think gone are the days where municipal leaders, are kind of ho-hum about these topics. They're understanding there's money out there to be had from the state and federal government to bring into the local area, which is one of the major things they're always looking for. And this is a very big growth area of where you can find money in these areas. So I mentioned the Great Give Back to You before. This was the outcome in 2021. We're going to bust all of these records this year. We're going to get the data for this in December, so we'll be able to share that with you. But the Sustainable Libraries Initiative, if you're not familiar with it, here's the URL. No cost. Come jump on the website. You can get on the newsletter list. You can see stories every month of libraries doing this work. You can come to webinars that get set up. There's lots of resources on the website for you. And if you want to up your game, you can join, become a member. There's all sorts of new stuff that's out there, from a vendor list if you're looking to source different things, to on-demand training. You get special deals on different things. Like we have a new e-course coming up with the American Library Association. We get some free seats for our members. And then if you are really all in, you can join the certification program, which you'll learn more about through the course of this series that Keturah has set up for you. But Keturah, I'm going to stop there and see if you've got any questions that have come through. But just before we do that, I just want to say thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And here's my contact info. I don't know if you can tell, but I really am into this stuff. I love hearing from libraries and what you're up to and how you're thinking about this kind of stuff. So I hope you'll connect and reach out and let me know what's going on at your library. But Keturah, I'll turn it over to you to see how you'd like to handle the next few minutes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rebekkah. That was fascinating. My brain is just like processing all of that information. I haven't seen any questions come in yet. So if anyone has any, please feel free. You can unmute and ask, or you can type it in the chat. Since Rebekkah has a slide up, I'm just going to mention we do have all of Rebekkah's books in the STLS consultant collection. So if you would like to borrow any of those, including I have my copy of this one right next to my desk. Just go into StarCAD or Workflows, you can borrow one. Jackie says, I appreciate everything you contribute, Rebekkah. I love your Board of Trustees Handbook Book Club.
That's a lot of fun. Yeah, thanks for saying that. We weren't sure if it would be popular, but we have hundreds of people show up every time, so I think it's working.
That actually made me, that makes me think of a question, Rebekkah. because I know you're also an expert on working with trustees, how can, I know like a lot of library staff probably, we agree with everything you said. How can we help get our trustees on board if they don't see, you know, maybe why they need to, like you talked about the living wage formula, how can we help get buy-in from our trustees on these ideas?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's something I think about a lot because I talk to a lot of trustees, and, you know, I always keep in mind that they're volunteers. They don't think about this every day like we do. But I also am respectful of the fact that I've been thinking about this for a long time. I've learned about it over time. I've come to my conclusions over time. So making sure we build in space for education for trustees, whether it's, you know, little orientations or analysis about why we have a revolving door for our part-time staff, or helping them understand what the community needs, whether it's through focus groups or surveys you're doing, or attending other community meetings where people are talking about the challenges in the community and bringing that back to your trustees so they see, I was a community-wide challenge with this, or emergency management's really worried about flooding in this area of the town, or helping, you know, just trustees have a broader view of what's going on in your local area and as well as the global community, right? So we're not in a silo in our little towns, but understanding what motivates trustees is to do right by their neighbors, whether that's spending their tax dollars wisely, producing a quality library that really makes a difference in people's lives, and then using that motivation to maybe frame some of these talking points that, you know, if we want to, you know, make a difference in people's lives, we got to start with our own staff. We have to treat them with dignity and help them see it's the right thing to do and make that case, but building in time to make that case and not getting frustrated when they don't get it the first time you say it is something I've learned the hard way over time. But what I found, most trustees are super reasonable. They want to do good things for the community, and they're looking to staff and directors for advice and technical assistance and research that help them make better decisions. So I do think we sometimes have to slow down and be more methodical about that. But most folks will get there unless you've got someone who has a real different agenda on the board. But sometimes that means a board retreat to discuss common goals and why we're all here, which can help reset the thinking there. But you're definitely going to run into some folks who really never get it or never really want to be a part of those conversations. And so then I really start looking at, where's my coalition of the willing? Who are the folks that do want to go in the right direction? How can they become ambassadors for these ideas? Or who is influential with a person who's like the one holdout, who can help us maybe make the case in a different way? So there's all different ways to come at these things, but it's definitely work, right? We definitely have to make time for that work.
Great. Thank you. I've also got a question here from Karen in Odessa. She asked if she wanted to look into an electric charging station, what would be the first step? Do you have any info on that?
You know, this is an area where, I mean, I am a lead AP. I have designed green buildings, but I am not an engineer. I'm not an electrician, right? So when we did our own research for electric vehicle charging stations, we turned to the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority to see what vendors they recommended. And that's who we went to for advice, which opened up the door to this whole funding stream that was available through our utility company. So we really looked to the experts for advice on this. So I don't feel like I got to learn all about this, right? There's people out there that do it for a living. They can expedite making choices for you and helping you tap into some of these funding sources. So again, that was the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, often referred to as NYSERDA, or giving your utility company a call and asking them if they've got expertise or a program that might help you with this. But certainly don't feel like you have to research specific models of EV charging stations unless you're really into it and you want to.
Thank you. That's awesome. I'll just give a shout out. I know Angela at Penn Yan has electric charging stations in her parking lot, as well as a shelter for Mennonite buggies and horses.
Oh, wow.
Are you there, Angela? No. Yes. Oh, she's in the chat. Okay. So we can also talk to her about how she got her information on her charging stations too. Great. Does anyone else have any more questions? Okay, just some thanks. Thanks from Karen. Awesome. Well, then we can let Rebekkah go. And thank you again, Rebekkah, for joining us. And everyone, you can sign up now for our next session in this series, which is on January 12th, we'll be talking about sustainability in library buildings and facilities. So you can sign up for that on our events calendar.
I
And
want to give a shout out to your panel at that next event. You've got some really impressive people on that panel, including Matt Bollerman, who's the co-founder of the Sustainable Libraries Initiative. He built a LEED building and was recognized in the first go around of the Library Journal New Landmark Library Series for that building he built in West Hampton. So you've got some great speakers coming up in January.
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah. And then we'll follow up in March on library programming and sustainability. And then in April, we'll hear from Anne Marie at the Sustainable Libraries Initiative. So everyone, you'll watch for more emails from me, and I will make this recording available if you want to share it with any of your coworkers or trustees. Again, thanks for joining us, and thank you, Rebekkah. Have a great day.